Welcome everybody, welcome to Marymount Looks Forward. So far in this series we've enjoyed perspectives from history with Professor Alessandra Necci, from faith with Reverend Sam Wells, from the White House with Speaker Newt Gingrich, and from literature with Professor John McCourt. Before we go any further, could I remind you of a few technical things? If you'd like to raise a point or ask a question during the discussion, if you could please make use of the chat function on Zoom to alert me so that I could bring you in. We really want to get a discussion, particularly during this talk, going. So please be brave and come forward if you have any thoughts or ideas that you want to put forward or any questions for Mr. Taylor. Also, if you could, it would be great if you can activate your video so that we can all see each other, particularly when you're making a contribution to the discussion. That would be great. So today, we really get to the heart of the matter. What will the next months and years look like for us as a school, for our families, and most importantly, for our students, looking at the remaining period of this pandemic and its aftermath? To help us answer this question, we are incredibly fortunate to be joined by Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. Founded in 1754, the RSA is a product of the Enlightenment wish to better understand the world and to make the world better. Past fellows have included Benjamin Franklin, Charles Dickens, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and it has driven reform in three key areas: creative learning and development, public services and communities, and economy, enterprise, and manufacturing. As Chief Executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor engages in discussion and debate with the Society's 30,000 fellows, not all at the same time, obviously, as well as with key thinkers, innovators, and world leaders. In other words, he's at the eye of a veritable hurricane of ideas and plans for the betterment of society. Over the past months, his work and discussions have been largely focused on how we can navigate through and out of the current pandemic, while taking the opportunity to make the changes that the world so desperately needs, whether that be regarding the environment, social justice, education, the economy, or urban development. In the audience today, also, and hopefully joining our discussion with us, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Eckhard Ernst, Chief Macroeconomist, let me say that again, macroeconomist at the ILO, Sébastien Maillard, Director of the Institut Jacques Delors, and Dr. Ruth van Dijk, Senior Lecturer in Social Policy at London South Bank University. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all of you for being here. Without further ado, and just as I click the last few people into the meeting, please allow me to pass on and introduce Chief Executive Matthew Taylor.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'll rely on you to tell me if the signal breaks down or it's too weak. I can move the computer closer to the router if necessary. But so I want to talk about the relationship between crisis and change. So it's worth just, I think, reflecting for a moment that even though we hope that we are through the worst of this pandemic, it will probably be one of the most, if not the most significant thing that has happened globally in the lives of people of my age. I'm nearly 60, so I was born well after the Second World War. And I have reached my age and nothing quite like this has ever happened before. And for young people today, it may well be that nothing quite like this happens again. And I hope in a way that that is true, because the one thing that could happen that's like this would be the effects of runaway climate change. And that's something that I'll come back to later. So I think I just want to say this is a very, very significant moment, and it will have impact on our economies, our society, culture, arts. I expect a whole slew of novels and films that are all around what's happened over the last few months and maybe about to unfold in the months to come. So this is a very important thing that is happening to us. And therefore, to argue that something like this is going to have wider ramifications, it's not just a bit of kind of aimless speculation. It's very likely, it seems to me, that what the world has gone through, or may still have to go through, will have major implications. And so that takes us to the question of what is the relationship between crisis and change. And I think that what history teaches us is that that relationship is contingent. That is to say, there is no certainty about how crisis will turn into long-term intentional change. And so let's think of a couple of historical contrasts here. The First World War and the way that leaders, nations responded to the First World War led indirectly to the horrors of the 1930s and the 1940s, arguably almost kind of the worst decades of modern human history. Contrast that with what happened after World War II, where the determination not to go back to the conditions of the 1930s, the conditions which partly gave rise to totalitarianism and conflict, was so great, was that determination, that a new settlement was created in the developed world, a period which the French refer to as les 30 glorieuses, because they were 30 glorious years in comparison to what we've become used to. So this is 30 years after the Second World War of full employment, of low inequality, of rising living standards, of relative social harmony, and relatively high levels of trust of government, a consensual kind of politics. And all of this taking place at the same time as the developed world was letting go of most of the last vestiges of colonialism. So that's a historical contrast. But there's a more recent contrast, I think, or more recent in the kind of timeframes that someone of my age thinks about. And that is with the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. Now, the AIDS epidemic was a terrible thing. You know, if you don't know about it, it's very hard to imagine. I think 300,000 people died in America alone, and that they were concentrated in particular communities. So if you were a young gay man in America at that time, it is almost impossible for you to have escaped bereavement of somebody very, very close to you. And you lived in constant terror for many, many years until treatment was found. So this was a terrible crisis. But yet we came out of that crisis with the gay community adapting its behaviors, taking responsibility, as someone I interviewed who was part of that movement said to me the other day on a podcast. We came out of it with investment in treatment, which has meant that now HIV is no longer a terminal diagnosis, and also the beginnings of a transformation in attitudes towards the LGBT community, which, you know, was inconceivable when I was young, that we would change our attitudes so dramatically, and that there would be, for example, a growing kind of consensus around gay marriage and issues like that. Contrast that with the financial crisis in 2007-8, where, you know, coming out of that, there was a widespread belief that we would learn some lessons about what led to that crisis, the financialization of the economy, the growth of inequality, the way that governments had kind of been asleep at the wheel. But those hopes were dashed. In many ways, things have either not been unchanged since 2007-8, or they've grown worse in terms of inequality. And of course, since then, we've seen much greater political polarization and the rise of populism. So how can we try to understand the relationship between crisis and change, and what might that tell us about the moment that we're in? So I'd like to suggest that there are three conditions which are necessary if crisis is to lead to long-term intentional change. The first is that before the crisis, there needs to be the demand for change and the capacity for change. So that is to say, it needs to pre-exist the crisis. Things don't come from nowhere in the middle of a crisis. There needs to be some latent demand and capacity for change. Secondly, during the crisis, the moment we're living through now, you need to see the demand for change increase, but also in the responses to the crisis, you need to see a different future being prefigured. You need to see things that happen which suggest and kind of verify to an extent what might be possible beyond. And then third and critically, and in my view, the thing that was really missing in 2007-8 in terms of deeper reform, you need political coalitions and practical policy ideas and social innovations ready, so that as you emerge from crisis and people are more open to new ideas, open even to the idea of making some sacrifices in order to get things back on track, that you can take advantage of that moment to do things differently. And I'll give you one other example, which is that, you know, we've watched over the last 2 decades the success of the German economy in comparison to, you know, most other countries, certainly in comparison to the UK. And part of the success of the German economy was because of the reforms that Gerhard Schröder, the German chancellor, introduced, which liberalized German labor regulations, made the German economy more dynamic. Now, Schröder was able to do that in part because he argued that that was the price that Germany had to pay for reunification. That's what Germany needed to do if it was going to bear the costs of reunification. So that's an example of how, if people feel that something is justified in terms of a greater goal, then they're willing to countenance change. So to complete what I want to say, what does that mean about today? Well, I think that there is a negative story and there is a positive story. And I will leave you with that, because one of the things I want to emphasize is that I think the very act of prediction is problematic. Once we start predicting the future, we deny our own agency. We kind of somehow say the future is out there waiting to be discovered. And in my view, the future is out there waiting to be created. So there is a dystopian view of the future based on my analysis. And that dystopian view of the future says, well, look what was latent. Look what was emerging up to the crisis. The growth of nationalism, the decline of global cooperation, a social polarization, the rise of a group of politicians willing to be opportunistic in exploiting social divisions in order to hold on to power. Well, couldn't all of that just become a whole lot worse? And I think you can construct a perfectly good argument for that. And you only have to look at President Trump or President Bolsonaro or President Putin, and you can see populists using the populist playbook to try to turn this disaster to their advantage, disregarding the responsibilities of government in favor of the usual kind of tactical game playing. So that's one set of things that could happen. But let's be positive. What are the other things that could happen? And in my view, what are the things that would happen if we actually listened to young people? Because, you know, for a long time, the basic reality of electoral politics in countries like the UK and the US has been that young people's voices have been drowned out by old people's voices. It was old people who voted for Brexit. It was older people who voted for Trump. You know, and it's about time that we started having some decisions made on behalf of younger people. And I think if younger people could choose what we learned from this crisis, they would say, well, the first thing we learned is the importance of thinking of the long term and preparing for risk. And we didn't know about the pandemic, although people did warn us and we did ignore it, but we do know about climate change. So can we finally learn the lesson now of the need to do today what is necessary to head off what is an even greater risk to humanity, which is the risk of climate change? There is an eerie and poignant similarity between the warnings of epidemiologists about pandemic, which we've been ignoring for the last 10 years, and the warnings about climate change from climatologists, which many people are still ignoring today. And then the second thing, and my final point, which is a slightly more speculative idea, but nevertheless, I wonder too whether what this will mark is a shift in the way that we think about human nature and human aspiration. You know, we have lived through a long era of materialist values, which have argued in the simplest terms that first of all, human beings should be understood as purely selfish utility maximizers, that the best way to understand humanity, to plan for humanity, is just to think that all we do is get what is best for us. Not much room there for altruism or empathy or compassion. No, human beings are utility maximizers. And associated with that is a notion that what human beings want, what makes them happy, is wealth, power, fame, the number of followers they have on social media. But the thing is that both these things are myths. They're myths. You know, we have somehow been seduced over decades into the mythology that human beings are basically bad and selfish people. All the evidence is the reverse. Actually, human beings, what makes us human is our sociability, is our capacity for compassion and altruism. The thing that makes us happiest is friendship, togetherness, belonging. So could this be a moment, because what we have seen in the last few weeks is what President Macron has described as the greatest show of solidarity the world has ever seen. As most people, I emphasize most people because there's been one or two in my own country who haven't, but most people have made immense sacrifices for the general good, and in particular to safeguard the most vulnerable in their communities. So can we take this immense demonstration of altruism, of compassion, of solidarity, and use it to change the way we think of human nature and to change our account of what really matters? Can we, for example, get away from the idea that work is something you do that you'd rather not do in order to get money and power, and instead say work should be something you do because it's part of how you are fulfilled and how you grow, and everybody's job should be a job that is fulfilling and enables them to grow, rather than assuming that half the jobs in the world are just dead-end jobs that you'd rather not do. So there might, it seems to me, be the possibility, and this won't happen overnight, but historians in 20 years might look back and say, actually what happened in that crisis was a kind of post-materialist turn. Human beings were reminded of their true nature and reminded of the things that really matter to them. And if you combine that with the fact that the demands of climate change mean that anyway we have got to step off what one economist has called the hedonic treadmill of constantly wanting more and more and more in a competitive process, because if we do that, the planet will boil. Put those things together, and it seems to me that if we took from this crisis what young people would like us to take from this crisis, it really could be the beginning of a new and exciting chapter for humankind.